Hello, and welcome back to another beautiful day of living environment. We are now up to day 5 of evolution, so make sure you have your notes out and follow along with me as we go through this PowerPoint together. All right, so today's aim is how do we use genotypic evidence to support evolution? Now, there are a few words we should pick out of this passage, or pick out of this aim rather, and annotate. The first one being genotypic. Now, if you think back to our genetics unit, we learned the difference between the words genotype and phenotype. So when we say genotypic, we're referring to the genotype. And if you remember that, we're just talking about genetics. Okay, so anything about genes, genetics, DNA is going to be genotypic evidence. Okay, but now when we hear the word evidence, that basically means you're just looking for proof of something. Okay, so now I've annotated genotypic evidence to be genetic proof. Okay, and finally, the last word we need to pick out is something that you should be familiar with at this point. It's the name of our unit, and that is evolution. Okay, so evolution, if you remember, we're talking about the change over time. Okay, specifically changes in species over time. All right, so I'm going to write change over time. Okay, so we're looking for proof that supports the theory of evolution. Let's find out what it is. All right, so our do now. The photograph below shows two penguins of the same species displaying different feather color patterns. The newly discovered all-black penguin had only black feathers since emerging from the egg. The sudden appearance of this characteristic was most likely due to what? Was it A, a change in environmental conditions, B, deposition of oil on the feathers due to pollution, C, a random change in the sequences of bases in DNA, or D, a change in the diet of the penguin chick? Okay, so in this example, we're trying to figure out what happened to this guy right here. Something happened to him that made all of his feathers black, and that hadn't previously been seen in this penguin population. Okay, but something we should pick out that's pretty important is he's had these black feathers since he emerged from the egg. So this happened before he was born. Okay, it's something that happened during development. Okay, so we're looking for something that happened during development or happened before this penguin was born. So I'll give you a hint. 3 of them have to do with after the penguin was born. So we've got to narrow it down to that one that's just talking about something that happened before. Let's go through them together. So A says a change in environmental conditions. Now, when we're talking about environmental conditions, we're probably talking about the external environments, the environment that that penguin was raised in. Is that something that happened before the penguin was born? Probably not. So we're probably not talking about A, because this is talking about an external environment or something that happened outside. Okay, but we'll come back to that. Maybe we are talking about the internal environment. It doesn't say. All right, what about B? Deposition of oil on the feathers due to pollution. Now, this is talking about like if this penguin walked over to a puddle of oil and tripped, and that oil got all over his white feathers and turned them black. Does that sound like something that happened during development? Or does that happen like something that happened after the penguin was born? That's talking about something that happened after the penguin was born, so it's not going to be B, because this is not something that happened during development. C, a random change in the sequences of bases in DNA. Now, this sounds kind of familiar. I think there might have been a vocabulary word that we gave you guys that describes a random change in DNA. It starts with an M. Hopefully, you got that that is actually just a fancy way of saying he has a mutation. Okay, and that's something that could happen during development. So we'll come back to that one. And D, a change in the diet of the penguin chick. This is talking about if the penguin was eating fish one day and then decided he had a change of heart and switched over to shrimp. And maybe when he started eating shrimp, then his feathers turned black. Is that something that can happen before the penguin is born? No. So a change in diet is also talking about something that would happen after the penguin's born. Only one of these is talking about something that happened during development, while or before the penguin was born, and that is he has a mutation. So he had some sort of change in his DNA that switched his feather color from the typical white, like this penguin over here, to having all black feathers. So he has a mutation in his DNA. So the correct answer here was C. If you have any questions as we go through this, just write down your questions and I will answer them whenever you ask me. All right, so remember today we're trying to figure out what are some examples of evidence or proof that we have to support evolution. So we've got a small passage for us to read that introduces that. I'm going to read through this. Make sure you are annotating this passage on your notes as we go through it. It's titled, "What Evidence Supports the Theory of Natural Selection?" Since Darwin first proposed his ideas about biological evolution and natural selection, different lines of research from many different branches of science have produced evidence supporting his beliefs that biological evolution occurs in part because of natural selection. Because a great amount of data supports the idea of biological evolution through natural selection, and because no scientific evidence has yet been found to prove this idea false, this idea is considered a scientific theory. Because lots of evidence supports scientific theories, they are usually accepted as true by a majority of scientists. Here's a brief summary of the evidence that supports the theory of evolution by natural selection. All right, before we move on, I do want to draw attention to the phrase scientific theory. Now, I think that Mr. Sterling went over this with you guys last week, but remember when we hear the phrase theory, we're talking about something that's not technically a fact, but it's generally accepted as true. And it's generally accepted as true because we have a lot of evidence that supports this theory, that confirms what we're saying, or what we suspect is true, but there's really no definite way for us to confirm that it's actually a fact because as far as I'm aware, none of us were back on the Galapagos Islands back when Darwin started studying this process, right? We can't physically see it happen because it happens over such broad generations. So we can't really prove that it's true, but we've got so much evidence that supports it and backs it up that it's very, very widely accepted. All right. Let's find out what some of our evidence is. So on your paper, I think there are like 10 different examples of evidence that supports our theory of evolution. So as we go through this, make sure you are writing down these bolded and underlined words into your notes because that's what you need to jot down. All right, so the very first, oh my God, I just lost my word. The very first topic that supports the theory of evolution is biochemistry. And what is biochemistry? Well, it's the study of the basic chemistry and processes that occur in cells. So it's basically talking about the chemistry behind it and the processes that make different functions of your cell work. So if you zoom in on a cell super, super close, you're able to look at the different processes that happen between your organelles and really what makes you work on a molecular level. And what does this show us? Well, if we look at biochemistry across the board between different organisms, we see that it's very, very similar. We all use the same amino acids. We all have those same, all the processes that we use are very, very similar. And that gives us evidence to infer that all of Earth's organisms share some sort of common ancestor. So because we have all of these biochemical structures and processes in common, that implies that we came from a similar origin. And so that is one reason why we use biochemistry to support this theory of evolution, because it shows that we all came from something similar at one point. Now, another thing you have to do on your paper is there's a place for you to highlight, I cannot speak, a place for you to highlight what type of evidence this can be classified as. The 4 different options are molecular evidence, genetic evidence, geological evidence, or phenotypic evidence. And you might be thinking, Ms. Collins, I don't know what the heck these things are. What do they mean? Well, don't worry, because we're about to go through them together. So the very first one, molecular evidence. So when you see the word molecular evidence, we're talking about, we're looking at molecules. And when we say the word molecules, we are essentially talking about very, very, very small structures. So like the tiniest atom of matter that you can think of. So molecules, all right, smallest form of matter. So molecular evidence, you're just talking about something, very, very small particles of information that still represent evolution and still support that theory of evolution. Okay, the next one is genetic evidence. Now, you should be pretty familiar with this word, right? When we say genetic evidence, we're just talking about DNA or genes. So any type of evidence for evolution that incorporates DNA or genes, we're going to classify as genetic evidence. All right, let's see if I can cram these in here. Our other options are geological evidence. Now, I'm gonna write that in green as, oh, that is ugly. We'll do it in black. All right, geological evidence. Now, you may have heard of the study of geology, right? And with geological evidence, we're talking about something that has to do with Earth's structure. So Earth's physical features. Yeah, I'm just gonna say it has to do with Earth. So Earth's, I feel like there's a definite better way to say that, but we're dealing with Earth structures. Let's see. So something that has to do with the physical Earth. And finally, guys, I'm not on my A game today. And finally, the last type of evidence that's possible is phenotypic. Let's do that in blue up here. All right, so phenotypic evidence. Think back to genotypes and phenotypes. When we talked about phenotypes, we were talking about physical characteristics of an organism. Okay, so physical characteristics of organism. Hope you can read that. Okay, so one more time, molecular evidence, we're talking about something that has to do with molecules, very, very small particles of matter. When we talk about genetic evidence, we're talking about something that has to do with your DNA or your genes. When we talk about geological evidence, we're talking about something that has to do with Earth structures. And phenotypic evidence, we're talking about physical characteristics of an organism. Okay, so now using those four definitions, what do you think we would classify biochemistry as? What type of evidence is biochemistry? We're talking about processes that occur inside the cell. So they're very, very small. Hopefully that gave you a hint. With biochemistry, we're going to classify this as molecular evidence. Once again, we're dealing with structures and functions inside the cell. So they're on a super, super tiny level. We're looking at the molecules that make up those cells and make them work. So we are going to classify this as molecular evidence. All right. The next evidence that supports evolution is known as comparative anatomy. And this is when we are comparing the structures of different living things. So what does this show us? Comparative anatomy shows us that the best explanation for similarities between organisms is that various species on Earth evolved from a common ancestor. So once again, we see similar structures in multiple species on Earth. And really the best explanation for that is that we all evolved from a common ancestor. So somewhere way down the line, we share an ancestor with all these different species, and that's why we have similar structures. Comparative anatomy was actually one of my favorite classes in college, so if you're interested in this, it's super, super cool. Now, using our four classifications, do you think comparative anatomy is talking about molecular evidence, genetic evidence, geological evidence, or phenotypic evidence? Well, since we're looking at structures between different species, we're talking about phenotypic evidence. And I've got a picture of what that looks like on my next slide. But go ahead and write down that this is indeed phenotypic evidence because we're looking at structures of different animals. All right. So you have this picture on your paper, but this is an example of what comparative anatomy is looking at. So here we have 4 different organisms. We've got a human arm, we've got a cat arm, we have a whale arm, fin, and we have a bat wing, okay? And obviously these are 4 different species. 4 different species that you think wouldn't be all that common, or that you wouldn't think had, wouldn't think, what? You wouldn't think they would be that similar, right? I don't think I have much similarities with a bat, but if you look at the bones that are highlighted in orange and yellow, we can see that these structures are actually very similar between each species. So your task is to examine the comparative anatomy of the bones of the front limbs of humans, cats, whales, and bats, pictured to the left. And I want you to figure out, are those bones shown known as homologous, which means they evolved from a common ancestor, or are they analogous, which means they evolved towards a common adaptation or function, like the wings of an insect versus the wings of a bird? So these are 2 words that you absolutely need to know. You need to know the difference between homologous structures and analogous structures. So homologous structures evolve from a common ancestor, meaning that they came from a similar, or they came from the same animal and just differed and evolved over time. Or are those structures analogous, which means that they don't necessarily have an ancestor in common, but they adapted the same structures for a similar function. So when we say a common adaptation, we're really talking about the function. So an example of analogous structures are going to be things like wings of an insect versus wings of a bird. As far as we're aware, those insects and birds don't have many ancestors in common, but they both developed wings over time to help them achieve whatever mission they needed to do. So they both needed to fly, so they both developed those wings. So do you think that these wow, guys, you're watching my demise on screen. Do you think that these 4 organisms share homologous structures or analogous structures? Do they come from the same ancestor or do they have the same function? Well, I hope you said that these are homologous structures, which means that they evolved from a common ancestor. And they share the same bone, just with variations throughout each species. So as far as I'm aware, we don't use our arms the same way that bats use their wings, right? We don't use those limbs for the same function or the same adaptation, so they're not analogous. We refer to these as homologous, which means that we've evolved from the same wow, guys, what's happening to me? We've evolved from a common ancestor, and those bones have adapted over time, but they are still similar because they have that background in common. Man, let's hope I make it through the rest of this recording. All right. Next up, the 3rd example or evidence that supports the theory of evolution is known as biogeography. And this is the study of living things around the globe. And what does this show us? Well, basically it shows us that groups of organisms that are related to one another will be clustered near one another because related organisms come from the same common ancestor. So species that are not related are going to be in 2 separate locations, but species that are related are going to be clustered in similar environments because they've come from the same ancestor, okay, and they're going to be right there next to each other in the same environment. So, oh, I just told you the answer. What type of evidence do you think this would be? We're talking about something that happens on Earth's surface, or the structures or the environment of Earth. So do you think that this is molecular evidence, genetic evidence, geological evidence, or phenotypic evidence? Well, I hope you said it's geological evidence, right? We're talking about something that happens on Earth. We're talking about Earth's structures, so it's going to be geological evidence. All right. Moving on to comparative embryology. Now, this is when we're comparing the embryos of different organisms. And when we say embryos, we're talking about like the early developments of an organism. So after the zygote develops a little bit more, we classify it as an embryo before we classify it as a fetus after it gets to a certain point. So with embryos, we're still talking about development of that organism. And what does comparative embryology show us? Well, once again, it shows us that we probably have a common ancestor with these organisms. So I've got a picture of this on the next screen, but with embryology, we're able to line up the timeline of development for different species and see that they actually look very, very similar. And that shows us that we have a common ancestor somewhere along the line because we develop similarly. Now, what type of evidence do you think comparative embryology is? Is it molecular? Is it phenotypic? Is it geological? Or is it genetic? Well, it is phenotypic evidence because we're able to look at the structures of those organisms throughout development and see that those organisms have similar structures as they develop over time. Okay, now I've got a picture of what that looks like. So this is what I mean when we can line up the development timeline of different species. So here we've got a fish that's in pink, a salamander in orange, a tortoise in green, a chicken in yellow, and a human in this tan color over here. Now, you wouldn't think that we would have much in common with something like a chicken or a tortoise, but if you look at early development up here, if you look at early development up here at the top, so this is the very beginning stage of that embryo development. Guys, they all look really, really similar. So these organisms all develop almost identically to one another, even though you would think that we wouldn't have much in common with them. So once again, this is the study of embryology, and we're able to figure out which species are most closely related based on this development, okay? And we're able to see that somewhere along the line, these animals must all share a common ancestor, and that's why we develop similarly. Okay, now obviously, as they continue to develop, they're going to have different characteristics, right? We don't look identical to this salamander over here, but we do look similarly up here in the beginning of development, which shows us that somewhere along the line, we do have a common ancestor. Super cool. All right, the next type of evidence is molecular biology. And this is when we're focusing on the structures and functions of the molecules that make up cells. So once again, we're talking about those small particles that make up our cells. And molecular biologists that have studied gene sequences amongst different species indicate a few things. And once again, this indicates that we have similarities among even very different species. So species that we wouldn't think are related still share molecular similarities that points out, hey, we have to have a common ancestor that allows us to have these similarities. Now, what type of evidence do you think this is? It's in the name, I'll tell you that. Do you think it's molecular, genetic, geological, or geographical, or phenotypical? What type of evidence? Well, we are talking about molecular evidence. Because this is molecular biology, we're talking about the tiniest of structures that make us similar. So this is molecular evidence. All right. Once again, if you have any questions as we go through this, please write them down and I can answer them in tutoring next week or this week, whatever day you're watching this. The next type of evidence is paleontology. And paleontology is the study of prehistoric life through fossil evidence. So we're looking at the fossil record, the fossils that remains of different organisms leave behind. And with those fossil records, we're able to see detailed evidence of the changes in living things over time. So we're able to look at fossils and look at how different structures changed as they developed. And we're able to see like, oh, this is actually how evolution happened. We're able to see how those fossils changed and see what structures changed and which ones remained the same. So do you think that this fossil record, this paleontology, is an example of molecular evidence, geographical evidence, genetic evidence, or which one am I forgetting? Phenotypic evidence. We're gonna get there eventually. I'm falling asleep. Um, well, this is actually gonna count as two things. It can count as phenotypic evidence as well as genetic evidence. So you might have said, wait, but these are found in the earth, so wouldn't we count it as geographical? Not really. So we're going to classify this as phenotypic evidence as well as genetic evidence, because like I said, we are looking at the structures of those fossils and seeing the structures that different organisms have. But we can also use this to find genetic evidence, because oftentimes we're able to extract DNA from those bones, and we're able to look at the genetic code that that species had, and then compare that DNA to other species that are similar or that are different. So this is phenotypic and genetic evidence. Now, your next fill in the blank is the word modern examples. And this is basically saying that we can use scientific experiments to measure evolutionary change. And these are things that we're able to see in real time, evolution that we're seeing happen in today. And one example of that is actually pretty cool. I'll attach the link to this, or I'll send it to you guys if you're interested. I was reading a study the other day that there's a type of salamander, or no, it's not, it's a lizard. It's not a salamander, but it's a lizard that actually we were able to see evolution happen within the span of like 15 to 20 years. So this species actually underwent evolution like within our lifetime because those lizards reproduce so quickly. So within, I think it was 20 generations and 15 years, we were able to see that those lizards developed stickier hands that allowed them to grip things easier. But we were able to see that modern example of evolution through the experiments that we're doing today. So read up about modern examples of evolution. There's some really cool research out there. But once again, this is evidence that supports the theory of evolution because we're able to see it happening right now. So do you think that this is molecular, phenotypic, geological, or geographical, or wow, guys, I'm falling apart over here. Or did I say genetic? Molecular, genetic, geological, phenotypic. Is that it? Yeah. What do you think this is an example of? Well, this is genetic evidence because we're able to look at the DNA of different organisms and figure out where are the similarities and where are the differences. Okay. Next up, we've got radioisotope dating, which is used to estimate the age of fossils. Okay, so with radioisotope dating, we're able to see isotopes, which are different forms of the atoms that make up matter on Earth. And some isotopes, which are called radioactive isotopes, discard particles over time and change into other elements. So by studying the decay of these isotopes, we're able to see how old fossils are and really where they fit in within that evolutionary timeline. So what type of evidence is this? Well, this is actually going to be two things, molecular as well as geological evidence, because we're looking at the molecules as well as that geological evidence that fossils bring. So we're able to look at how old those fossils are as well as how they fit within, I just said this, but within that evolutionary timeline to see how things are similar and how they're different and really how they fit in this puzzle of life. All right. And I think that is our last type of evidence. Yep. So that is the evidence that we have to support evolution. Of course, as we learn more and figure out more about this, we're going to find more evidence because science never really ends, guys. It's a constant pursuit of trying to figure out more. So as we continue to learn more, I'm sure we'll add to that list. But as of right now, that's where we're at. So now on the bottom of the second page, I think, I've got some examples of different types of evidence, and we're going to work together to see how we can classify that, to see if we're going to classify that as molecular, as phenotypic, as geological, or as genetic evidence. Okay, so this first example, we have a fossil named Archaeopteryx, which has many features in common with reptiles, but also, like birds, shows evidence of feathers. So what type of evidence do you think this is? Go ahead and write your guess down on your paper. So I'll tell you, we are looking at features that they have in common, Okay, so when we say features, we could also say that we're talking about structures they have in common. And let's find out. So this is going to be an example of phenotypic evidence. As I just told you, we're looking at the structures that those organisms have in common, those physical structures. And so we're talking about phenotypic evidence. All right, next up, the genetic code of all life on Earth is written in the same chemical building blocks. So here we are talking, oh man, we're talking about genetic code, okay? When we hear the phrase genetic code, we are talking about genetics or even DNA, right? So knowing that we're talking about genetics or DNA, what type of evidence do you think we're looking at here? Well, I hope you said we're looking at genetic evidence. It's written in the question. So genetic evidence is what we're looking at here because we are looking at that DNA. All right, next up, in the 1940s, infections by the bacteria Staphylococcus aureus could be treated successfully with penicillin. Today, populations exist that are completely resistant to natural penicillin, as well as to partially modified penicillins like methicillin. These populations, called MRSA, are very challenging to modern medical professions or professionals. So this is an example of how bacteria are evolving too. They're evolving to be resistant to our antibiotics, which is actually a really real problem that we're currently undergoing. So stay tuned to see what happens there. So what type of evidence is this? We see that our bacteria are becoming resistant to those antibiotics. What type of evidence do you think that this is? Well, this is an example of molecular evidence because we're able to see on a very small level the really the mechanisms behind these resistance and what's happening on a smaller scale and how that affects the whole. All right, next up, whales have tiny, useless bones. I think that's how I could be described, just a tiny, tiny, useless bone inside the rear portion of their bodies that are very similar to the bones found in vertebrate legs. So what type of evidence is this, that we have similar bones or similar structures to other species? Well, I hope you said that this is phenotypic evidence, right? We're looking at these structures, these physical structures um, on this animal. So we're able to see similarities and differences in phenotypic evidence between these animals. All right, human embryos have gill slits like those seen in fish embryos. Developing fish retain their gill slits, whereas humans don't. So remember, this is what we were talking about with embryology, how all of these organisms look very, very similar as they go through development. What type of evidence do you think this is, that we're able to look at that embryology and figure out the similarities and differences? Well, this is an example of phenotypic evidence. So same thing as last time, we're talking about structures that are seen within organisms. So the human embryos and the fish embryos have the same structures, which is phenotypic evidence. All right, marsupial mammals, mammals like kangaroos that protect their young in a pouch, live in just a few places in the world today: Australia, South America, and part of North America. Although Australia is now thousands of miles away from the Americas, in the past the three continents were connected as one larger landmass. So this is talking about that issue of geography, right, where we see similar organisms found on similar, God, I can't phrase this right, found on similar islands, right? Because if you think back to Pangea, we had all of these animals in, or all of these land masses in one location. As they spread out, they took those organisms with them. So what type of evidence is this? Well, since we're talking about the Earth, we are talking about geological evidence here because this is something that has to do with the Earth and its environment. All right, I think this might be the last one, but don't quote me on that. Fossils of the earliest life forms on Earth, which look like bacterial cells, occur in rocks that scientists estimate to be 3.5 billion years old. So what evidence are we talking about here? Well, we're looking at fossils, we're looking at how old those fossils are, and we're looking at what the organisms look like. So what type of evidence do you think this is? This is a tricky one. Go ahead and write your guess down. All right, and we're actually looking at two different types of evidence here. We're looking at phenotypic evidence as well as genetic evidence, because once again, we're looking at the structures. We're seeing that those earliest life forms look like bacteria, but we're also looking at genetic evidence, where we're able to look at the genetic code and figure out really how similar these organisms are. Right. Yes, I was right. That is the last one. So that's all I have for you guys today. Now, there are, I think, 9 practice questions on your paper that I do want you to answer. Those are some practice Regents questions about evolution. So go ahead and complete those as your homework tonight and submit those when you submit your paper. If you're doing it on Google Docs, it's a picture, right? So if you just want to write the answers to your question below, so you can just write, like, carry it onto another page and write, like, the answer to number 1 is A, the answer to number 2 is B. You can do it like that instead of physically writing on the picture. All right, once again, write down any questions you've had about this lesson. I'm sorry, this is absolutely not my best. I think I was having a stroke for most of this. But if you have any questions about this, let me know and I'll do my best to help you out. Other than that, have a wonderful day and I'll see you guys later.